electric fence manual in there too.
It is good. That's a really good practical guide.
The offset publication is in there too under Jeremy's section. It's a real nice 3-page publication that Jeremy and I and Morgan Hayes, one of our ag engineers, wrote, I guess a year or two ago.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Jeremy. Let's give Jeremy a hand. I'm going to round the day out today, and it's probably the worst time to be on the program. Everybody's tired. We've been outside half the day. But this is kind of a key presentation when we talk about designing grazing systems, and that's thinking about what kind of forage species we want in our grazing system. One thing I'll just remind you all of is if you haven't had a chance to jot down your survey comments and mark the speakers, make sure and do that. These surveys are really important to us to help us improve the grazing school. All right, I want to talk about forage species for a comprehensive grazing system. And by comprehensive, I mean a grazing system that's going to reduce our need for stored forage. We're never going to eliminate our need for stored forage, but we want to reduce it as much as we possibly can. If we look at a cow-calf budget, and we look at all the different things that go into that budget, the number one piece, the biggest slice of that pie, is going to be winter feed. It accounts for over half of the total cow-calf budget. And the more days that we feed, the bigger that slice gets. So when we think about managing our costs in a cow-calf system, we really need to focus on the big pieces of that pie. When things get tight, cow-calf producers start to cut things. They'll cut things like maybe they won't spend enough money on a replacement bull, or maybe they will skimp on salt and mineral program, or maybe not call the vet when they need to. All those things are fairly small pieces of the pie. If we really want to make an impact on the overall profitability in a ruminant livestock production system, we've got to concentrate on that biggest piece of the pie, and that's going to be winter feed cost. And that's kind of what this presentation is about reducing the number of days that we're actually feeding hay within the grazing system. Grazing is really a pretty amazing thing. We've got these guys right here, and they're replacing a whole bunch of things. They replace a tractor in diesel fuel and hay equipment. They're harvesting the forage themselves. And every day that we graze, we're saving money. And so the point that I want to make with the simplistic slide is that anything we can do to allow these guys to do what they do best, and that's harvest forage for themselves, is going to increase the overall profitability of the grazing system. We've got a ton of forages. I know everybody's tired, and they're looking at this list like, we're never going to get out of here tonight. And we're not going to talk about all these, but the point is we've got a ton of different forages that are adapted to Kentucky. And some are better adapted than others, and we're going to talk about some of those key species today, and those are those ones in green. And we're going to kind of talk about how they fit into a grazing system where we're going to be able to reduce the amount of stored forage that we need within that system. So just in general, and by the way, this presentation is under 8, right? Section 8, and it's about halfway through it. So in general, we can take our grasses and kind of split them up into 2 broad categories, and that's cool and warm season grasses. Our cool season grasses are going to have optimal growth at a leaf temperature of somewhere around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So those are going to be things like orchard grass and tall fescue and Kentucky bluegrass. Those are C3 species or cool season grasses. They're going to have peak photosynthesis in the spring and the fall when the temperatures are cooler. When we get above 70 degrees Fahrenheit, as we move into the summer months and into 80 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit, their photosynthetic pathway becomes much less efficient. They're going to tend to be more digestible and higher in crude protein and have a longer total growing season in a transition state like Kentucky. Our warm season grasses are not going to have optimal growth until the leaf temperature gets around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're going to grow right in the middle of the summer months. They're going to be most productive when our cool season grass growth is limited during the summer month by high temperatures. They tend to be less digestible and lower in crude protein. They're more efficient at using nitrogen, so they don't need as much nitrogen, and nitrogen is a major constituent of crude protein. And they tend to have a different fiber structure within the plant, and they tend to be a little bit less digestible. They're definitely more drought tolerant during the summer months, so they can give us some drought tolerance within our grazing system if we would incorporate a warm season grass into the grazing system. And they're more efficient at using water, and that's a big deal. In the summer months, when we have a limited amount of water, our warm season grasses are going to produce about twice as much dry matter with that unit of water compared to our cool season grasses. The reason I'm telling you that is if you have the option to irrigate a small amount of forage on your farm to fill in the summer months, you're much better off irrigating a warm season grass because they'll produce about twice as much water as a cool season grass, or twice as much dry matter per unit of water as a cool season grass. Even if you're in a rain-fed system, when we get small amounts of rainfall, they're going to be much more productive during the summer months. This is just a nice graphical depiction of a warm and cool season grass. This was taken in March. This is tall fescue. It's up and growing over here. This is Bermudagrass. It's not dead, it's just dormant. It's a warm season grass that hasn't gotten warm enough for it to actually initiate growth yet. And then in the back, I just want to point out in the back here, it's kind of hard to see in the corner, we have a little piece of alfalfa there. And alfalfa is kind of an intermediate species between warm and cool season grasses. This is a growth curve of tall fescue and ladino clover in western Kentucky. So this is a cool season grass and a cool season legume. So we're going to get a hump of growth in the spring. Remember, it's going to be most productive when the temperatures are cooler. As things start to warm up in late spring and early summer, we see a decrease in the amount of growth in our cool season grasses. And then we get a secondary hump of growth in the fall when things start to cool down again. That's a very typical cool season grass growth. So what that gives us is a couple periods of deficit here. We've got our deficit period during the summer months, and that's where a warm season grass can really fill in within a grazing system. And if we lay the growth curve of a summer annual grass, so that would be something like a sorghum Sudan grass or a crabgrass or a pearl millet, over this cool season grass growth, we can see how nicely it complements the growth within this grazing system. So having a small amount of summer annual grasses can really fill in the summer deficit that we often have in cool season perennial forage systems. The first species I want to talk about is kind of the grass we love to hate, and that's tall fescue. This is by far our best adapted grass. And as much as we moan and complain about tall fescue, you know, the simple fact is it's weaned more calves in the state than any other grass, and it's our best adapted grass. And we really need to be thinking about it as a blessing rather than a curse, and we need to ask ourselves, how do we fit tall fescue into a system that's going to be profitable on our farm? And the answer is we need to focus on management. And fescue's got some problems. It's got the endophyte that lives within the plant. That's a fungus that lives between the plant cells. And it in combination with the plant, produces a toxin which reduces animal productivity during the summer months, causing the animal to run essentially a low-grade fever. And that reduces dry matter intake and animal performance during the summer months. So it's not a perfect grass, but it's by far our best adapted grass. So we need to ask ourselves, how do we manage this grass within the system? And we need to think about things like optimizing soil fertility, managing for legumes. That's a very, very important part of managing tall fescue, is to manage for legumes within that grazing system. And legumes have other benefits that we'll talk about in a little bit, past just mitigating the effect of tall fescue. Incorporating the novel endophyte tall fescue varieties into grazing systems. I don't mean to tell everybody to go home and replant your whole farm into novel endophyte tall fescue, but you need to look for opportunities to introduce novel endophyte tall fescue into your grazing system when they show themselves. Novel endophyte tall fescue is a type of tall fescue that has an endophyte with it, but it doesn't produce the toxins that negatively impact animal performance. So that's been a real new chapter in the whole tall fescue story. And then probably the strongest and most underutilized aspect of tall fescue is stockpiling for winter grazing. And Justin talked about that when we were on the farm this afternoon, how he feeds some hay in during the late summer and fall to allow his pastures to stockpile so that he can graze during the winter months. This is a very effective tool for reducing the amount of days that we have to feed hay within a grazing system. And this is from February 16th, we have some stockpile tall fescue underneath snow here. 16% crude protein, 34% ADF, 60% TDN. The point that I want to make is that a well-stockpiled tall fescue is almost always going to be higher in forage quality than most of the hay that we make in Kentucky. So this can be a high-quality feed source for cow-calf operations during the winter months. Talk just a little bit about orchard grass, one of my favorite grasses. It's kind of a bunch grass that forms an open sod. It doesn't tolerate close and frequent defoliation. Probably one of the worst things that have ever happened to orchard grass is the invention of the disc mower. The disc mower cuts so close to the soil surface if it's not adjusted correctly, and that's really hard on orchard grass stands. When we cut really close, especially moving into the summer months, we're going to decrease the persistence of orchard grass markedly. Same way it goes with grazing. If we're grazing orchard grass, we need to make sure that we don't graze it too close, especially as we move into the summer months. It kind of acts like a short-lived perennial in our grazing and haying systems in western Kentucky. It's got some insect and disease issues. Its real fit is for high-quality horse hay. Horse people tend to love orchard grass. And one of the questions is there more persistent varieties? And I think there are some better varieties out there. And we have a very extensive variety testing program at the University of Kentucky, which is available on our Forage's website. But at the end of the day, even the most persistent orchard grass varieties are still orchard grass. So they're not going to be as persistent as tall fescue within grazing systems. Alfalfa, queen of the forages, often referred to as queen of the forages. Sometimes I call it the pouty princess. And the reason I call it the pouty princess is while it's a very productive legume within grazing and haying systems, it also has very exacting soil requirements. It does not like wet feet, and it does not like low soil fertility. So you've got to have well-drained, fertile soils for alfalfa to be persistent and productive. It's a long-lived perennial if those soil conditions are met. Has good drought tolerance and a very aggressive nitrogen fixer. We can fix between the equivalent of 150 to 250 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year with alfalfa. We need well-drained soils, high in fertility, and it needs to be rotationally stocked. So if you're in a continuous stocking system, it's just not going to work. You have to rotationally graze it and give it time to rest. And it can cause bloat if it's alone in a monoculture. So normally we'd want to have it mixed with some grass if we're going to graze it. Red clover is probably one of our most important pasture legumes. It's a short-lived perennial, so if we seed it this year, it's going to last 2 to 3 years, depending on whether we use an improved variety or a common type. So we always recommend improved varieties. Dr. Henning did some really good work a number of years ago that showed a certified Kenland seed would last 3 years, and an uncertified Kenland seed would last 1 to 2 years at the most. So make sure if you're going to use red clover, use an improved variety that's been tested in Kentucky that we know is well adapted here, and that's going to give you another 1 to 2 years persistence. It has good drought tolerance, not as good as alfalfa, excellent seedling vigor. It's probably one of our most vigorous seedlings, and that makes it really well adapted to frost seeding into pastures. And make sure you use certified seed. Probably one of our older varieties and still one of our better varieties is Kenland. Kenland was selected at the University of Kentucky, so it's well adapted to Kentucky. And it's a public variety, so that means that we have to buy certified seed. We can buy Kenland seed that's not certified, but we're not sure what's in that bag unless it's been certified. So make sure you get the seed with the blue tag that says certified, and then that's a guarantee that we're actually getting Kenland in that bag. White clover is an important pasture legume. It comes in 3 types. We have kind of our small or our Dutch white clover, which is what you would kind of find volunteering in a pasture. It's very small in stature, small leaves, and grows very close to the ground. It's okay, but it's not as productive as a large or a ladino type white clover. A larger or ladino type white clover are going to produce about 3 to 5 times as much dry matter. So whenever we talk about using or frost seeding a white clover, normally we would mix it with some red, and then we would use a ladino or a large type, and that's going to give us higher productivity within the pastures. It has a structure called stolons, and that's one of the neat things about white clover. So it's a modified stem that grows along the soil surface, and wherever there's a node, it can actually put a root system down. And this allows white clover to kind of creep and fill spaces in within the stand. So if I have some distance between my bunch grasses like orchard grass or tall fescue, white clover can fill those gaps in. And when it fills those gaps in, it keeps other things from coming into that pasture, such as weeds. It doesn't have great drought tolerance, but it's very persistent via reseeding. So it produces hard seed, which can lay in the soil for decades and come back up when the conditions get right. Very high in forage quality, and one of the reasons it's high in forage quality is that when the animals graze white clover, they're grazing just the leaf and the petiole. They're not actually grazing the stem because it's down close to the soil surface. So it's extremely high in forage quality. Annual Lespedeza, this is kind of one of those legumes that we've forgotten about. This is a warm season annual, non-bloating legume, tolerant to lower fertility and low pH. So if you have a farm that you're kind of rejuvenating or renovating, that you don't have enough money to spend a lot on fertilizer, this may be a good legume to overseed that farm with, because it is better adapted to that lower fertility conditions. There's 2 types, Kobe and Korean. Generally, we recommend Korean. It's a little bit higher producing, has better drought tolerance, and more dependable reseeding. It is truly an annual, so that means it has to come back from seed every year. So if you're counting on annual Lespedeza, you're going to need to spread a little bit of seed on each year to make sure that it comes back. Now, there's no reason that we can't do a 3-way mixture with red and white clover. We could do, say, 4 to 6 pounds of red clover, 1 to 2 pounds of large white or a ladino clover, and 10 pounds of annual Lespedeza, and that could be our frost seeding mixture, especially if our soil fertility is a little bit lower on that farm. Sericea Lespedeza. Now, Sericea is a long-lived perennial warm season non-bloating legume. It's our only perennial warm season legume that's adapted to Kentucky. So it's well adapted to transition zone states, so that's states that aren't in the north and not in the south, so they include things like Tennessee and Kentucky, North Carolina, and Virginia. Extremely tolerant of drought, probably one of our most drought-tolerant forage species, and also very tolerant of acidic soils. So normally where we see a lot of Sericea Lespedeza would be on road cuts, so where we're trying to revegetate that, or reclaimed mine land. So in western Kentucky, we have a lot of reclaimed mine land, and we'll see a lot of Sericea has been used in reclamation mixes there. Is it our best legume? Probably not our best forage species, but if that's something that we have, then we need to learn how to manage that within the grazing system. There are some newer cultivars out there. Really, the only one that's commercially available would be a variety called AU Grazer. It's been selected under grazing, and it has finer stems and moderate levels of tannins, which make it taste astringent to the animal, and better grazing tolerance. Like alfalfa, it really needs to be grazed rotationally. We can graze it out of stands if we graze it too hard. And it has poor seedling vigor, so it doesn't really pop out of the ground and establish as well as something like red clover would. So the other fit for Sericea Lespedeza would be for small ruminants. It does have some natural anti-worming or worming effects that can be used in small ruminant grazing systems. Bermudagrass. We don't commonly think of Bermudagrass in Kentucky, but actually as we move west and south in the state, Bermudagrass is becoming more and more adapted to those regions of the state. Relatively little Bermudagrass is planted, and one of the reasons have not used an extensive amount of Bermudagrass in western Kentucky has been the problem with getting it established. Most hybrid Bermudagrasses are sterile, so they don't produce viable seed, and that means that we have to establish it from sprigs. And those are pieces of the plant, crowns of the plant, runners, and they have to be dug up and then transported to another field and incorporated into that field. And we've never really had the right equipment or infrastructure to facilitate that. Now, one of the most exciting things with Bermudagrass is the development of more cold-tolerant seeded Bermudagrass cultivars. We actually put a trial out last year in Livingston County, one county over from here, with 3 different varieties of seeded Bermudagrass on a farm. And about 5 or 6 years ago, we put a trial in with a seeded Bermudagrass cultivar in Marshall County with Nikki Ryan and Jake Shadow, and that stand has persisted well through the winters that we've had so far. So seeded Bermudagrass is marketed kind of funny. So it's marketed as either a pure cultivar in a bag, and that's just one pure variety in a bag. Most normally it's marketed as a blend, and that's several cultivars within that bag. If you look at the seed tag on a blend, it will tell you what cultivars are in there. We want to avoid blends that have Arizona Common or Giant Bermudagrass. Those just do not have the cold tolerance that we need for the northern transition zone. It's a little tricky with Bermudagrass marketing because the same trade name can be used from year to year. So like Ranchero, Frio, and what's in the bag can be completely different from year to year. So it's important if you're going to try a seed of Bermudagrass to make sure you look at the seed tag and make sure the cultivars on there are going to have good cold tolerance. And we could expect them to persist in western Kentucky. This is just some data I had. I had a 10-year trial when I was in Virginia. And what I wanted to show you was that some of these seeded Bermudagrass cultivars produced on average in this period of 2002 to 2008, 7.5 tons of dry matter. Now that's a lot of dry matter. That doesn't come for free. If you want productivity like that, you're going to have to fertilize those stands to optimize that productivity, and that means nitrogen fertilizer, along with potash and phosphorus that we're removing in the hay. This was a trial that I did when I was in Virginia, and one of my sides was when I went on a farm and I saw a good local ecotype of Bermudagrass, I would collect it and bring it back to the research station and put it in plots. And these are some of my selections highlighted in yellow here. We had one I got from a county jail in the south side of Virginia, and it was actually a pretty decent variety. It averaged 7 tons of dry matter over several years in this particular trial. Another one was from the research station in Virginia, and this was from the northern Piedmont, average 7 tons. The reason I'm showing you this data is that some of you probably already have common Bermudagrass on your farm, and there's a lot of variation in what we call common Bermudagrass. So some are more productive when you put them under good management than other common Bermudagrasses. So if you have one and you just want to work with what you have, try improving your management of that Bermudagrass, and that may meet your summer forage needs without you going out and planting an improved variety. I just put this in to remind you this is a Bermudagrass nitrogen response trial. So this is dry matter on the y-axis. On the x-axis is increasing nitrogen rate. And we can see that we get a linear response to nitrogen up to around 400 pounds to 500 pounds of nitrogen. We'll never put that much nitrogen on a farm, but we do want to be on this straight part of the curve. So we're going to need to put around 200 to 240 pounds of nitrogen on really to optimize Bermudagrass production. The reason I'm telling you this is that if you think Bermudagrass is something that you want within your grazing system, you've got to be willing to spend a little bit of money on nitrogen fertilizer within that grazing system. Bermudagrass can be good when it's well managed, can have pretty good crude protein. This was between 14 and 15%, and total digestible nutrients were in the mid-60s, and this was harvested on a 30-day schedule. So every 30 days we were cutting it within this grazing system, or in this haying system. Crabgrass is one of those things that we commonly consider a weed, but it actually can be a pretty good forage. It's well adapted to this whole Mid-South region. It's an annual that kind of acts like a perennial through prolific reseeding. So annual means it has to come back from seed every year. But it's a really prolific reseeder, so it produces a lot of seed that can create volunteer stands that next year. It really needs to be double cropped if we're growing it alone, double cropped with a winter annual like annual ryegrass that we saw at Justin and Kate's today, or a small grain to kind of grow from late fall till early summer. And then when Bermudagrass germinates and comes up when the soil temperature reaches around 60 degrees Fahrenheit. It's good yield potential, not as good as Bermudagrass, but it exceeds Bermudagrass in terms of forage quality. Animal performance is almost always going to be higher on crabgrass compared to Bermudagrass. No prussic acid like we would find in a sorghum Sudan grass, but it can accumulate nitrates under very heavy nitrogen fertilization. This is actually a nitrogen trial with crabgrass, and that's crabgrass 60 days after seeding. And we had multiple nitrogen rates from 0 to 400 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So it can be very productive, and the improved crabgrass varieties actually have been selected for leafier plants in more upright growth. And so if you're thinking about crabgrass, think about using one of these improved varieties. And still, one of my favorite improved varieties is Red River. Even though it's a pretty old variety, it's a good, solid variety of crabgrass. And again, like other warm season grasses, it responds to nitrogen fertilization, so you have to make that commitment to put some nitrogen on to really optimize production. And we don't need to be up here at 300 pounds of nitrogen. We need to be on the straight part of this curve, somewhere around 100 or 125 pounds applied as a split application of nitrogen for crabgrass. Forage quality is where it really excels, and we had digestibilities of 75 to 90%, which is very high. Crude protein, in season of around 10 to 14%. As we get towards the end of the season, the plant was dying off, it would be 6 or 8%. And of course, crude protein is closely related to nitrogen fertilization in warm season annual grasses. So as we improve nitrogen fertilization, we tend to boost crude protein. This is kind of some interesting work that R.L. Dalrymple did at the Noble Foundation when he was working there. He said on medium quality crabgrass, we were going to gain somewhere between, with stocker calves unsupplemented, a pound, 1.85 pounds a day. And excellent quality crabgrass over 2 pounds a day. So forage quality is actually quite high on crabgrass. We've got a producer on the other side of the lakes that's grass finishing beef cattle, and he's actually used this crabgrass as a summer forage in his grazing system. I call this perennial Sudax, but it's really Johnsongrass, right? And we've been taught by the row crop guys that Johnsongrass is evil, right? Actually, in a grazing situation, it's actually one of the most palatable plants in the summer pasture is going to be Johnsongrass. And under continuous stocking, animals will graze it out of the pasture because they graze it repeatedly, and eventually they will kill it within a pasture. Where does Johnsongrass really thrive at? it thrives under intermittent defoliation. So that would be a hay field, right? So we cut it and we allow it to regrow, and that's where Johnsongrass does really well at. And one of the challenges with grazing systems is that sometimes when we improve grazing management, especially during the summer months, we tend to favor something like Johnsongrass because we're actually grazing it, resting it, and allowing it to regrow. And in a continuous stocking system, Johnsongrass would never get that chance because it's defoliated as soon as it starts to regrow a little bit. So it spreads by seeds and rhizomes, and please don't go home and tell somebody that I told you to plant Johnsongrass because I didn't tell you that, but sometimes you have that resource on a farm. And you have to decide what you're going to do with that resource. Are you going to pull your hair out and fight Mother Nature, or are you going to kind of incorporate it into a grazing system? And that's a decision that you have to make on a farm-by-farm basis. And again, thrives under hay management, not found in continuously stocked pastures, responds well to nitrogen fertilization. So if we fertilize it and we incorporate it into a hay production program, we actually can produce some good quality summer hay from this species. And that means harvesting it when it doesn't get too tall. We don't want to harvest it when it's past the boot stage. That's when that seed head is just coming out. It does have prussic acid, so it can cause poisoning at frost, is the largest chance of prussic acid poisoning. And it can accumulate nitrates under high fertilization and drought conditions. This was just an interesting thing I picked out of the literature, and they looked at a nutritive value of different summer grasses. And lo and behold, the number one on their list for nutritive value was Johnsongrass, with an average crude protein of over 11%. So, and a TDN of 58%. So it can be part of a forage system if we manage it. Don't plant it, but if you've got it, maybe you can manage it within your grazing system. Just want to touch on the sorghum species. So that includes things like sorghum, forage sorghum, sorghum Sudan grass, and then sorghums and Sudan grass, and pearl millet. This was some work that I did in Virginia, and I had done a lot of work with summer annual variety testing for a long time. And this was one of the first years in 2009 that I tested not only the yield, but also the digestibility of these summer annuals. And so when I got the results back, I had a large range in digestibilities, from 54% to 74%. And I said, well, for sure, the species, the variety that had the 54% is going to be the most productive, is going to be the most advanced in yield, and have the lowest digestibility. And when I started to match the data up, what was interesting was that some of the highest producing varieties in the trial were also some of the most digestible. And that kind of got me interested in this relationship between yield and digestibility in these summer annuals. And we tested this for a number of years. And the varieties that tended to be more digestible were also the varieties that had a trait called the brown midrib trait. And that's where the actual midrib of this leaf is kind of a brown or a tannish color. And that's a phenotypic or an outward expression of something that's different within that plant. And what the difference is the lignin level. Brown midrib varieties tend to have lower levels of lignin. Lignin is a compound that makes plant fiber less digestible in the rumen of the animal. So lower levels of lignin are associated with increased digestibility and animal performance. So when we took a look at the BMR trait and its relation to digestibility, the black bar shows BMR type varieties, and that's in vitro true digestibility. That's when we take that forage, put it in rumen fluid from the animal, and measure what disappears. So the higher that is, the more digestible that plant is. What we found was, on average, we had 3 to 5% increase in digestibility just by using a BMR variety. So if you're thinking about using a summer annual and you're going to use sorghum Sudan grass or Sudan grass, consider using a BMR variety that is going to have increased digestibility and animal performance. So I had a ton of data from these variety trials, and I had them in big spreadsheets like this, just thousands of pieces of data, and I showed them to people, and they say, well, that's nice. And And that's about all it came. So what I needed to figure out how to do was how to express this relationship between yield and digestibility. And what we did is we graphed yield on the x-axis against digestibility on the y-axis. And then we indexed it against the average for the trial. So 0 here on this scale was the average yield for the trial. So we could rank all the varieties either above average or below average for yield, and we did the same thing for digestibility. 0 on this y-axis was the average for the trial, so some were more digestible, some were less digestible. And then we could take this graph and put it into 4 quadrants. And if you look at the lower left quadrant, those are varieties that have below average yield and below average digestibility. Those are varieties that we don't want to put in a forage program. If you look at the upper right-hand quadrant, we have varieties with high digestibility in high yield. Those are varieties that we want to take a second look at for a forage program because they excel both in how much dry matter they produce, but also how digestible that dry matter is. And so we started to graph these out over multiple years, and what we found was these varieties that performed well or above average for both yield and digestibility for multiple years in a row. Those are varieties that you want to consider looking at for a forage program. So one of the questions that you always have to think about is kind of where do summer annuals fit into forage systems? And probably the best place is not as a standalone forage for a forage program, but as a part of a renovation system. And so we have a lot of missed opportunities when we talk about using improved varieties, and we're not taking advantage of improved forage genetics. We can use summer annuals as a tool to kind of rotate those into grazing systems. And probably the best example of this is the novel endophyte tall fescue. So again, we have tall fescue with a toxic endophyte, with no endophyte, and with a novel endophyte. And this is animal performance. So we had average daily gains in this particular study of 0.9 pounds a day with a toxic endophyte versus 1.4 pounds a day. Same grass base, just a different endophyte. So we increased average daily gains by half of a pound a day just by switching to the novel endophyte. That's a huge difference in animal performance. And we really need to think about incorporating novel endophyte into grazing systems if we can, and we can use summer annuals as a tool to get this done. So kind of the sequence that you would take for this would be you would identify the weakest pasture that's in need of renovation. Come in, you spray it out with a non-selective herbicide in the spring. Plant a summer annual or a summer annual mixture. Graze or harvest those summer annuals. Spray it again in late summer, early fall, and then establish that improved cool season forage or a novel endophyte in this case. And then you start to move to the next pasture. So you don't do all the farm one year, but you use this summer annual as a renovation tool to incorporate novel endophyte tall fescue into grazing systems.
Spray with what? Like summer herbicide again, or what? Spray with what?
Yeah, spray again with a non-selective herbicide, probably a glyphosate type herbicide. All right, so let's think just a little bit further outside the box. And I grew up on a farm in northeast Ohio when we grazed corn residue every year. And the question I have is sometimes you get caught with a little bit of corn left. What do we do with this? Do we harvest it or do we graze it? And so we did a study when I was in Virginia looking at standing corn, harvesting standing corn. So this was a grazing type corn. We had a conventional type corn, just a good solid pioneer variety, and then a sorghum Sudan grass. And we had the most dry matter production from the sorghum Sudan grass, but it was also the lowest in forage quality. Our corn, standing corn varieties had about 7.5 tons of standing dry matter per acre. And our standard corn variety was better than in terms of dry matter, was better than our grazing type corn. When we looked at whole plant total digestible nutrients, that's a measure of energy, what we found was that we exceeded the needs of lactating brood cow and a growing steer in terms of energy by grazing standing corn. Where it fell short was on crude protein, so we would need to supplement crude protein if you're going to graze standing corn. This could be a way of extending your grazing season and reducing the amount of hay that you need within your system if you incorporated some standing corn within the grazing system. We saw some annual ryegrass out at Justin and Kate's today, and this is probably my favorite winter annual grass. And it is an annual grass, so that means it needs to be replanted every year. It's extremely high in forage quality, and it just makes a wall of high quality forage in early spring, and it starts to tail off as growth becomes temperature limited in early summer. And what I want to point out with annual ryegrass is very consistent production. So this is multiple years of data, and we have about somewhere around 3 to 4 tons of production on average with annual ryegrass. So even though we had a dry fall last winter, we can still see the rows of annual ryegrass that Justin drilled into that pasture, and it's going to come on this spring as things start to warm up. So what I'm going to do now is kind of finish things up by putting everything together into a grazing system. And our goal, of course, is about 300 days of grazing. And this is a potential system for what we call the transition zone states like Kentucky. We start out with a tall fescue base. That's kind of what the good Lord gave us, right? And then the first thing that we can do to extend grazing is to stockpile. So we stockpile normally in late summer. The second hump, we save that for deferred grazing, and then we can graze it as we get into January and February. And then we can add a summer annual into this grazing system, maybe as part of a renovation scheme, and that kind of fills in those summer months when tall fescue is less productive within this grazing system. And then where that summer annual was, we could add a little bit of winter annual, like annual ryegrass or even a small grain into that grazing system to fill in those remaining gaps. Now look, I don't live in a fantasy world. It's easier to do this on a slide than it is to do it in the real world, right, where we're fighting drought and flood. But the point is that we have a lot of tools in our toolbox in terms of forage species. And it's up to us to open that toolbox up, get them out, and kind of fit them into a system that works for each of us on our different farms. And every farm is going to look a little bit different in terms of their grazing system. Is there any questions? So generally speaking, it's better if we manage cool season and warm season grasses separately. Now, in the real world, we like to talk about monocultures and pastures, but we very rarely have monocultures. And you saw that today in the pastures that you set your little paddocks up in. That was supposed to be tall fescue, but it was a pretty strong mixture of bluegrass in that pasture and tall fescue in that pasture. And as we get into the summer months, we'll see some warm season grasses come up in perennial pastures too. So I guess the answer is it's better to manage them separately, but in the real world, we're probably going to have a mixture. And how we manage that mixture with grazing management can impact what's dominant. So say I had a mixture of tall fescue and Bermudagrass, which we commonly find in western Kentucky. If I manage for that Bermudagrass during the summer months, so I graze it closer and I put nitrogen on the summer months, I'm going to shift that botanical composition towards that Bermudagrass. If I want to manage it for the fescue, then I lay off in the summertime, I fertilize in the spring or the fall to stimulate that tall fescue growth, and I don't graze it as close in the summertime, and that's going to shift that botanical composition towards the tall fescue within that pasture. So the point I want to make is that grazing management is a powerful tool for managing botanical composition in pastures. And we can shift pastures around, botanical composition around to kind of meet our needs. Is there any other questions? So in your publication underneath the Pasture Renovation tab, there'll be a cross-seeding publication that goes into detail, but it's referring to both the time and method of establishment. So what we're doing is broadcasting that seed on during the winter months, and as the soil freezes and thaws, it causes small cracks to form or frost heaving to form in that soil. And that incorporates small seeded things like red clover and white clover and annual Lespedeza into the soil. So it's a kind of a method of seeding, one of our most inexpensive methods and one of the most accessible to most producers. It does not work as well with grasses. We'll talk more about that tomorrow.
You said, well, you showed that picture of stockpiling, I think it was the Johnsongrass in the snow.
The tall fescue. It was tall fescue.
Okay.
Yeah.
But here you say stockpile, so are you talking about stockpile like having over hay, or are you talking about?
So stockpiling is generally referred to saving forage during deferring grazing on forage during one part of the year to use at another time of the year. Most commonly done in late summer with tall fescue, and then saving it for the winter months. We can do summer stockpiling, which we didn't include in this presentation, but might be an interesting part where we actually, Jeff talked about that this morning, I think, a little bit. You know, we always want to keep our pastures vegetative, but sometimes I think it's better to let it grow a little bit in the summertime. And the dry matter is not going to be that high a quality, but if you're in a fall calving system and you're in the middle of the summer and you've got a dry cow, it's going to be good enough for that dry cow in the summer months.
Well, let's go a line further. How about we shed hay from August, September, October?
Yep. Yeah.
Fall calving cows, maybe a little bit of town, but not terrible.
Yeah.
Stockpile that fescue.
And then utilize that. The challenge with stockpiling is that if you get into a dry fall, we don't get a lot of growth, you're going to have a backup, and that's kind of where hay comes into the system at. We can't detach ourselves completely from hay. As much as we would like to, we can't do that. You've got to have a reserve in the barn for environmental challenges as you go through the grazing season. Is there any other questions? Guys, thanks for hanging in with us today. We're going to adjourn for today. We'll be back here tomorrow at 8 o'clock. And we're going to go out after lunch and see how well you did with your paddocks.